Shalom. In this video, we're going to take a look at the Ehya Asher Ehya, or as it's often translated, I am who I am, or I am that I am, as found in Exodus 3 verse 14. But we're going to look at it in context with the verse before it and the verse after it, because there's some interesting clues here about the character and the name of Yahweh. And that is what we're going to be examining here. So to begin, let's look at Exodus chapter 3 verse 13. And Moshe said to the Elohim, "Look, I am going to the sons of Israel, and I will say to them, Elohim of your fathers sent me to you. And they will say to me, what is his name? What will I say?" So here we can see in this verse that Moshe wants to know the name of the Elohim that he is meeting with, so that he can tell them who he is. Now let's take a look at verse 14. And Elohim said to Moshe, Ehya Asher Ehya. We're going to come back to this, and we'll take a look at this phrase here in a little while, but let's continue on. And he said, "Thus you will say to the sons of Israel, Ehya sent me to you." The name Elohim gives to Moshe is Ehya. Interesting that we always hear Yahweh, Jehovah, Yahweh, Jehovah, etc., but you don't very often hear people say that his name is Ehya. And yet right here in verse 14 it says that his name is Ehya. Now let's take a look at the root of this word Ehya, and that's the He Yod He, or Haya. We're going to conjugate this verb. First person is Ehya. Ehya means I exist. Now, the verb haya literally means to exist, but we can also translate it with the verb to be in English. In fact, most of the time it is translated with the verb to be. In this case, I am. And as an example, you can see the word Ehya used in Exodus 4 verse 12. The second person would be Tihya. That means you exist, or you are. And an example of this word can be found in Exodus 4 verse 16, if you want to look these up. Then in the third person is Yihyeh. He exists, or he is. An example is also found in Exodus 4 verse 16. So now let's take a look at Ehya. That's the first person, I exist. We could also translate that as I will exist. One of the differences between Hebrew, or biblical Hebrew, and English is that biblical Hebrew only has two tenses: perfect tense, imperfect tense. Now the Ehya is imperfect tense, and I'm not going to go into too much detail here about the perfect and imperfect, but understand that perfect tense means completed action, imperfect tense means incomplete action. These tenses are related to action. The Hebrew language is a very action language. It's related to function, action, these concrete concepts. Now the English tenses are past, present, and future, and they're related to time. So recognize that when we translate a Hebrew verb, when we translate it into English, we have to convert a verb whose tense is related to action and convert it into an English verb that's related to time. Now, this doesn't always work well, and this is one of the problems with translations. When you're reading the Bible in Hebrew and you understand these concepts, the translation problem doesn't exist because you're thinking in Hebrew and not in English. But for the sake of our study here, we're going to have to convert this Hebrew verb into an English verb. Now the imperfect tense, as I said, is incomplete action. Now that may be an action that has already started, but is not yet finished, or it may be an action that has not even started yet. So ehya, as an imperfect, can be translated as I exist, that's the English present tense, or I will exist, the English future tense. We could also translate that as I am, using the verb to be. Now, let's take a look at that phrase that we saw in verse 14. Ehya asher ehya. Here we have the word ehya, and then the word asher. Asher is the relative pronoun. It can be translated as which, who, what, because. It depends on the context of how this is used and how we're going to translate it. We could translate that as I will exist because I will exist. I exist because I exist. I am who I am. We could also translate this as I will be who I will be, or I am that which exists. When a translator is translating the text, he has to decide what that best translation is to put in the text. In other words, he would choose from like one of these five, and there's also other choices as well. He would choose one of these and then put that into the text. However, because the Hebrew language is so dynamic, it's not which one of these five is the best translation of the text. In fact, all five of these convey the idea in ehya asher ehya. That's how dynamic the Hebrew language is. You really cannot translate one Hebrew word with one English word and convey the entire meaning of the Hebrew. In fact, it would even be better to translate one Hebrew word with an entire sentence in English, because of the richness of the Hebrew language. So don't look at these five to say which one you think best fits the idea in this verse. Instead, recognize that all of this encompasses the meaning of ehya asher ehya.
The Sashu's god in Jordan was named Yahoo with the letters YHW. That name, Yahoo, is strangely similar to the name Yahweh. The Sashu lived in Midian in modern-day Saudi Arabia. We have in Egyptian sources something that appears to be a name like Yahweh in the nearness of Midian. When the Israelites left Egypt, they passed through Midian, and they got inspiration by the Sashu's pagan god Yahoo. Yahoo eventually became Yahweh, but the roots of that name came from the pagan Midian god Yahoo. So Yahweh is a pagan name, was originally a pagan god, or a name of a pagan god in Midian by the Israelites, and it's not the name of God. Basically, I would suggest getting this book, The Invention of God by Thomas Rohr, where he talks about how Yahweh was a pagan god in Ugarit terms, and on chapters hang on one second. In chapter 4 of the book, he talks about chapter 4 to chapter 5. He talks about how Yahweh became the God of Israel and the entrance of Yahweh into Jerusalem, and how what is the origin of Yahweh. And Yahweh is definitely a pagan god from Canaanite and Edomite and Midianite paganism. So Yahweh definitely is not the name of a god according to scholarship, according to archaeological evidence, etc., etc. So I would just recommend this book, The Invention of God by Thomas Rohr, where he talks about the pagan origins of for example, he says Yahweh can be found far back as the early 20th century before Christ era in Ugarit. So he basically traces the origins of Yahweh, and Yahweh definitely was not the name of God. Basically, people in Judah and Israel had many gods, and they just took one. They just took one, Yahweh, and made it into their chief god. So this book basically, this book definitely talks about the origins of Yahweh and how Yahweh was not the name of God, but it was pagan. It was a pagan god that was taken from, it was a name of a pagan god that was taken from, pre-Judaic cultures like Canaanite, Ugarit, and Midianite culture. So I'll just recommend this book to, in chapters 2 to 5, he talks about how Yahweh was a pagan god and then eventually became the god of the Jews when they were writing the Old Testament. So Yahweh is basically a pagan god that the Israelites stole from pre-Judaic paganism.